are moving around and about. Just a reminder you're all familiar with to turn off Blackberries and cell phones. It is my pleasure to introduce this session entitled, Can We Rethink Consumer Behavior? Going Green in America? An enormously important topic, and we have a remarkable person to lead this discussion in Fred Dust, who's a partner at IDEO, a global design and innovation firm. He's advised and designed for many of the world's leading companies, nonprofits, universities, and taught and written extensively. And it is my pleasure to call Fred up. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So just so you know, I think it's a 3D screen, so I'm expecting a bunch of 3D things to happen, from what I understand. This is, at the very worst, we'll watch Shrek. Again. But so I thought I would start by saying that we'll cover a lot in the next hour or so. We probably won't cover the greening of America. It's actually a pretty big topic. I'm mostly going to be focusing on behavior change and the ways that design impacts behavior change. Some of the examples I'll be using will be from sustainability clients' greening issues, but not all of it. It's going to be mostly focused around design and the way that design actually helps change behavior, and then ultimately how design kind of focuses towards participation. So with that, I thought I'd sort of open by asking a question to the audience, which is, what is good design? Can anyone throw out examples of things that seem like they're good design? You can start with an iPod if that's fine. This whole campus? Great. Coke bottle's nice too. I'm going to stop you guys because I kind of stacked the deck. Pretty much whenever I ask this question in an audience, the very first thing that comes up is Apple. It's not because it's the only example of great design. This campus is phenomenal. It's a great place to kind of both socialize and circulate. Coke bottle's a great example of an American brand. However, Apple, for some reason, is always the first thing that comes to mind. And it is because it's a phenomenal example of great design. When you look at their products, iPad, they're beautiful. They do amazing things. They're wonderful to hold. But the real thing that we think is, actually, is there a way to lower the lights a little bit on the front here? Because we're not getting the full 3D effect. But if not, it's fine. The real thing that actually makes Apple great at design is less the way things look, though things look quite beautiful, but more the way things act. Basically, everything within an Apple product, an Apple concept, an Apple store acts differently than other kinds of products. If you go to a store, it actually, if you go like, this is a store in New York during lunchtime, they're more like public parks than they are stores. People are dating each other there, they're trying to pick each other up, they're having lunch. It's like, it's more of a civic space than it is a public space. And so really good design, we believe, it acts different. It acts differently than other things. I'll give you another example. It's really controversial now, just mostly because they don't stop, which makes it maybe a less great example of, of great design. But Prius is another one that I would hold out as an example of great design, and comes up quite often. And what's fascinating about Prius is, again, in fact, it sort of looks like an iPad, but that's not what makes it great design. In fact, one of the things that I believe makes the Prius a phenomenal example of great design is this. How many people have been in a Prius before? Great. Oh, good. Of course. It's Aspen. We'd expect everyone to be in a Prius. I'm sure that there's a ton out there. But as you know, on the dashboard, there's a screen. And what that screen does is it actually continually monitors the energy that you're using as a driver. So as you're driving, you're continually seeing how you're doing and how well you're kind of consuming energy or how little energy you're consuming. And what that does is it actually makes you act different. You actually are participating in the way that the car actually functions better. In fact, it's really interesting. I come from Los Angeles. I live in a canyon where it's basically all Priuses. So in the morning, it's just the hush of Priuses as they kind of leave the canyon. And nobody wants to walk their dog between like 7 and 9 in the morning because everyone spends so much time looking at their screens. And then with the kind of hush of the Prius, it's a very dangerous time to be out with animals. So, but again, good design gets us to act differently. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today. How do we begin to act differently? Ever know Good, the magazine? There's a really interesting story. We got to work really closely with a founder of Good, actually, who was an Aspen fellow for the First Movers Fellow here. And he told us a great story about starting Good, which is that when he started the magazine, everyone was like, you're crazy. why would you start a magazine? This makes no sense. And he basically was like, we're going to do it anyway. And he consulted with a bunch of people who had developed magazine concepts before, and they said, what you have to do is do direct mail, and you're basically going to pay $40 for every person that you get, so you're going to lose money for the first 2 or 3 years. Just get used to it. And so they were like, well, that's ridiculous. If we're going to lose that much money, why don't we actually just kind of reshift the way we actually think about starting this magazine and just give memberships away? And when people take memberships, we'll take the $20 that we would have lost, basically, the difference between what they were paying, and we'll donate that to a charity of that person's cause. So what they found is they got people very interested very soon and very actively, but not quite fast enough. And so one of the things they did is they stopped and they looked at their market and they said, who are we trying to get at? We're trying to get at social entrepreneurs, people who are socially responsible, often people who have just graduated from college. What do they need more than anything? And what they realized is that they need cocktails. That was a really big thing if you were young, just graduated, and were really interested in social innovation. And so they started throwing cocktail parties where they would sign you up, and over time, they were able to actually move the magazine into the black very quickly. In fact, it's 2 years in, and they're like doing phenomenally well, way better than other magazines are doing. So one of the things that I would say also is that good design actually reframes the problem itself. And that's often one of the things that we need to do most, especially as we're thinking about really big problems. And then lastly, everyone's a designer. We design all the time. This is actually from a party at Aspen. This is people cooling their beer in a river. It's a great example. We're continually remaking the world around us to make it work better for us. There are actually people amongst us who are really, really good at that, and we actually want to tap into that. And so one of the things I think we need to be doing is think about how we tap into our own inner designer. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how we change behaviors by having people tap into what they are as a designer. And that's especially important when we're dealing with really big problems. There is no design solution for greening America. There's no one person who will come up with a concept that will think of something. We'll do tons and tons and tons of work. There'll be tons of science that will be focused on this. But the most important thing we can do as we move forward towards greening, or any big movement that we need to do, is make sure that we ourselves participate. And often, even the people in this room, people who are most kind of connected to the topics at hand, we don't naturally participate. We don't naturally get involved with the challenges that are there. And so one of the questions we have is how we can do that. So we need design more than ever, or at least I believe that. We are all workers. We actually all need to be working all the time. We actually need to move consumption to participation. It's one of the things that we do. One of the things, just a quick kind of background from stories that we've seen before, sorry, it's a little slow because it's working off a PDF, is that we assume that most of our world is consumption. We assume that most of our world is service, that things are meant to be given to us. This is a great example. It's a project story from IDEO when we worked with TSA. And it was a really interesting thing spending time working with TSA. And the whole time we're working with them, they're like, we feel bad because we can't give good service to the people who are coming through. And then you would talk to people who would be coming through the TSA experience. They'd be saying, this is bad service. We need better service. But what's funny, if you stop and think about TSA and the way it was set up and the reason it was actually set up, TSA is not a service. It's actually a job. It's a job that both parties, the TSOs and the passengers who are going through the system, are doing. We're both working in it. We're both participating. And in fact, most of the things that we do are like that. Many of the things that require the most, the kind of most change actually require the most work from us. So if you're a patient in a hospital, you're not being served. You're actually working in the system to make yourself better. If you're dealing with childhood obesity, if you're dealing with other kinds of things, these are all work where both the consumer and the group that are helping the consumer both have to work together. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing today. So how do we inspire change? So what I thought I would do is share 7 thoughts that we've seen on inspiring change. Most of the things I'm going to share are not from IDEO's work. It's just from things we've seen in the world, where we've seen really interesting change catch on. And I thought I would share it with you and then kind of open it up for questions at the end to kind of talk about how we might apply this to the topic at hand. So the first thing we believe at IDEO is that to get real change, you have to have real insight. We can't actually base our notions of what we should be doing for any kind of constituent, any kind of consumer, on assumptions. This makes me a very unreliable narrator. I love any book about epidemiology. I read all of them, like the Paul Farmer books and the Laurie Garrett books. Anything about it is fascinating. So I don't actually quite know where this story is from. If anyone knows, I'd be really curious. I think it's Paul Farmer, but it's a great example, I think, about how assumptions can actually create the wrong solution. So they were seeing, and I think it was an uptick of plague in small villages, and it was in Haiti. That's why I'm saying I think it's Paul Farmer. And their assumption was this had a lot to do with the fact that there was a lot of extra rat dander and that the houses were not clean, and so that it was actually causing a lot of issues, and that's what was actually spreading the plague. It's a very natural assumption to make if you were just to look at something from the outside. Paul, and I'm going to just use him, went out, spent time in the villages and watched people to sort of see what was happening, to see how this might have spread. And one of the things he noticed is that, in fact, the opposite of the assumption was true, that, in fact, the villagers were incredibly clean. Every single morning, they would sweep the floors of their huts every morning and do it religiously, so it was actually utterly spotless. They would do it simultaneous to actually cooking the morning porridge. So one of the things that he realized was, in fact, it was the cleanliness that was actually causing the spread, because as they would sweep, the rat dander would go into the porridge, and then people would ingest it, and that would actually cause a fast growth of plague. So exactly the wrong assumption was being made about how to kind of fix something. And he's a great example. Any other really good epidemiologist who basically also uses ethnographic research as a way to go forward are really interesting examples of people to look at when you're looking at studying change. My favorite story actually comes from a whole other context. This is actually a mayor by the name of Anton Mocus. I don't know if you know him. He was the mayor of Bogota, Colombia, for a while. And when he inherited Bogota, it was actually in serious, serious disarray. Massive issues with water, massive issues with pollution and cleanliness, serious issues with crime and traffic fatalities. In fact, one of the highest in Latin America was traffic fatalities. And he basically said, we need to start to kind of do things, prototype change. And so he did what you would expect. In this case, with the traffic fatalities, he went forward and he charged people more money. He put more expensive tickets on people who were jaywalking or were making illegal turns, did things like that, and found that it actually wasn't having impact. And so he sat with a group of people and said, we're all Colombians. We all know what it means to be Colombian. What do we think we can do that can actually make an impact here? What do Colombians value if they don't value being disincentivized through high fines? And one of the things that came up was, well, we value our pride. We care more about our pride than anything else. And so he said, great, let's try this. And what he did is he hired 80 mimes to stand on the street corners. That's what you're seeing here. This is a mime. And what the mime would do would run out onto the street when somebody was actually making some kind of illegal turn or doing jaywalking with this big sign saying incorrecto and humiliate the person. It's pretty humiliating. And they saw within months that traffic fatalities had dropped radically. In fact, it was so successful that one of the things he did is he went forward and trained even regular police force to think about how they could use this kind of tactic when they were actually going forward and trying to change behavior. So again, a real insight, something true, something deep, often will lead us to more insight about how to change something than assumptions. Number 2, sorry, I'm gonna get water. We hold things quite deeply. There are some things that we do because we've been trained to do it, and there are some things we do because, in fact, they're almost innate. And when we can build off of those, they become quite helpful. One of my favorite examples is recycling. My father loves recycling. He loves to do it. I don't understand it. Like he'll spend a whole Sunday recycling, and you'll sit and you'll be with him, what's going on? You'll be like, this is work. And he just loves it. And what you realize is that if you give an infant a bunch of different shapes with a bunch of different kinds of little slots to put it in, they'll spend a whole day sorting the shapes into different things. There's something very primal about the idea of sorting our things. And so recycling, I think, actually plays into that. Another great example, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, it's the fly in the urinal. I think it was in Denmark. They were having a lot of trouble with actually people missing the urinal. And so they did all kinds of things, all kinds of warnings. And finally, they just put a little fake fly in one corner and found that everyone aimed, and they basically didn't have to clean up as much. So when possible, going in and tapping into primal things, deeper meanings, actually is really helpful. One of the most interesting things, this just came through at IDEO and I was fascinated, is Iceland's kind of attempt to kind of have good financial impact, and doing it by having every Icelandic citizen send an invitation out to the world saying, please come visit us. I don't know if anyone's gotten these. This actually just went around our company, an all IDEO email from one of our Icelandic employees saying, please come visit Iceland. We really need you now more than ever. You'd be bad neighbors and bad coworkers if you didn't come visit Iceland. Basically drawing on the kind of more primal thing of saying, well, we really should be we should accept this invitation. So I love the idea of using something very simple as a way of beginning to solve problems. We've actually seen it, one of the things that we talk about quite a bit when we go out is piggybacking. So seeing one kind of behavior and trying to piggyback a good behavior on top of it. So this is an example from one of our projects. This is one of our projects that was called Keep the Change, done for Bank of America. And it was a great example when they were looking at trying to figure out savings products for women and how to get women engaged in savings, and basically weren't seeing any ways to do it. So we went out and saw some really simple behaviors, but the most basic one that we saw was women, one woman in specific, who basically would keep a big Ziploc bag in her purse. And as she would pay for something in cash, she would take the change, put it in a Ziploc bag, and we'd say, well, what are you doing? And she'd be like, well, I'm keeping the change, and I'm using it for my child's education account. I put it in the end every end of the week, and it actually piles up. It's the way I save. So we're like, huh, keep the change. It was actually not much of a leap to kind of figure out how to do it. So they actually built this into a product that was actually an ATM card that allowed you to kind of round up the money that you actually spent so that it actually went into a savings account that you chose. And it's been the most successful savings product they've ever developed. Very simple behavior, very simple piggybacking onto behaviors that already exist and then building a system around it. This one I think is maybe a bit controversial, especially when we think about behavior change, because I think we often believe that given people the right information is enough to get them to change. I would say we know for a fact that that's actually not true. Has anyone been watching Jamie Oliver's Food Revolution? A couple people. So does anyone recognize this scene? This is a phenomenal thing. A while back ago, he decided one of his tactics was to take a bunch of kids, because he was having really bad luck getting these kids to eat healthy, take a bunch of kids and teach them what was in Chicken McNuggets. And so basically what he does, and you can watch it on YouTube, he spends about 4 or 5 minutes taking apart the chicken, chopping it up, blending it into this like really disgusting, repulsive pulp, straining it through stuff, and the kids are screaming. I mean, they're screaming through the entire experience. Then he breads it, and he kind of explains everything that's in it, all the bad stuff that's in it, and then he fries it up, and everyone's like disgusted and screaming. He's like, okay, well, who wants Chicken McNuggets? And everyone's like, me, everybody. They all raise their hands immediately. So it was a great example of, even though they had all the evidence, they'd actually seen what happened, they still were making choices that we might consider poor choices. And so often when looking for things, we'll think about trying to design things that actually rely not always on information, but often on myth. These are great examples from when I was a kid. I don't know if anyone remembers Bubble Yum, but when I was a kid, Bubble Yum was like, it swept the country. Like literally, like you'd have to go to like Wyoming to get it and bring it back, and all your friends would be like, oh, Bubble Yum. And then maybe 6 months into it, I think there was another brand called Bubblicious, I'm sure they actually started it, that basically spread the rumor, someone spread the rumor, that the sugar, the kind of crunchiness in Bubble Yum, was actually not sugar, but it was spider's eggs. And literally, the market dropped almost like overnight. People stopped chewing it for so myths like that can actually really make big differences. Zima is a great one. Again, this is from my high school, which is that basically people believe that if you had Zima, there's no way to tell if there was alcohol in your breath. There was actually just no way. Total myth, again. But myths matter. They make a difference. And so sometimes when we're thinking about kind of creating change, creating the right kind of myth can make a really foundational difference. I'm going to tell a story. I just came back from Peru. We're actually doing a project right now on Peruvian participation in the government. A really interesting project. But very first day we were out and saw this fantastic example of this, which is that pretty much one of the things that keeps people from participating in political, anything political in Peru is this notion that the government is corrupt. And that notion of corruption actually goes all the way from the top, all the way down to the street level, the police. And in Lima specifically, there's a belief that the police in Lima are the most corrupt of all. So anytime they're ticketing you, they're basically grafting, that there's no way you should be trusting the police. And so we were sort of spending time out, kind of talking with people as we're doing our research. And we heard this great story, how about actually maybe it was like more like 10 years ago, Lima decided to take this on. They wanted to fix the notion that the police force was corrupt, and they tried to figure out what to do. And they looked at their culture, and they realized that there's a myth that in their culture, women, may or may not be true, but it's a perception at least, that women are fair and trust and won't take graft and actually aren't easily corruptible. So what they did is they actually created a force called Phoenix. And the Phoenix force was an all-women police force. And what's amazing is it changed the perception of Lima police. People believe it's less corrupt. And what's funny is when you talk to people, they'll say, well, I'm not sure it's less corrupt. It just feels less corrupt. So there's no definite evidence. Actually, we were in earlier sessions where people were talking about definite evidence. There's no evidence that this has actually made Lima police less corrupt, but it's certainly changed the way people feel about it and the way people feel about kind of engaging with police. So myth can be a really powerful tool. Keeping it simple. Complexity is one of the most difficult things we see. This is actually another example from Peru, where actually the more complex it is, the more and more difficult it is to actually find a way to involve. So finding simple ways in can make huge differences. This was actually, I love this because it's sort of an example of complexity and simplicity simultaneously. This was on a 4th grade wall in Peru, and it's basically a graphic trying to explain global warming and global cooling. And so it's incredibly complex, but they're still trying to make it simple. But on the other side, there's just like, with all this terrible stuff that's happening, here's 6 things you can do. You can ride your bike. You can not use aerosols. Really simple solutions to actually thinking about a very complex system. So giving people simple steps, simple acts can make a big difference. I don't know if anyone knows CoolBiz. It was a program that was set forth in Japan, and the whole idea was, again, could they actually basically cut down on air conditioning costs in buildings in the summer in Japan? And the way they did it, rather than saying it's just going to be hotter or everybody kind of pitch in, is they actually created this thing called CoolBiz, which was basically the notion that if men dressed down, i.e. didn't wear a tie and actually had their collar open, they'd feel cooler. And they had like the prime minister, they had all these famous people dressing down for a day, all these fashion designers building CoolBiz fashion, all to kind of get people with the notion that on Fridays people would dress down and thereby feel cooler. So what I love is it's an incredibly simple act. All it is taking your tie off, but it actually kind of can create quite profound change. We believe that time is a really important impact on kind of affecting change. And I think there's some really great examples of it. And I thought I'd kind of break it down in kind of different kinds of time. So one is things like Earth Hour. I don't know if you know this. This actually started about 4 or 5 years ago. I think the first city was Toronto, Australia. They basically powered down for an hour, basically to protest and kind of say, we actually believe that we need to be making big change towards global warming. What's happened is it's caught on year after year after year to now it's actually kind of like grown to be this kind of massive movement where once a year cities all over the world shut down for an hour as a way of kind of signing up for the notion that we should be focusing on this kind of change. This is a great story if anyone doesn't know it. Estonia, really small country in Eastern Europe, basically had a massive problem with rubbish. Trash all over the country. That for years and years and years, people have been dragging their old, I guess, like dishwashers and everything like clothes washers into the forest and letting them kind of rot there. So basically, beautiful forests, but basically had been taken over by rubbish over years and years and years. And so what they decided to do was to do a countrywide cleanup. But what I love is that instead of trying to do a countrywide cleanup and do it over time, they were like, let's do it in a day. Let's get 40,000 volunteers and let's get them together and let's give them 5 hours and have them clean up. And literally, they were able to clean up massive portions of the country within a really short period of time. So these sort of small deadlines actually allow people to engage in different kinds of ways. Another example that we see are celebratory ones, and these actually start to set rhythms. This is critical mass. This is critical mass in San Francisco. But critical mass is it's one night a month where basically everybody decides to take bikes instead of cars, and they literally take over the streets. And at the same time, it's crazy. I mean, literally, everyone's wasted, and it's like all the bars do really well that night. And it's this massive celebration, but it catches on and it has gone on for years and years and years in the cities where it takes on. So the celebratory aspect becomes quite significant here. And over time, what we see is that these things can become more lifetime rhythms. Again, another example, just since I returned from Peru, that I thought was fantastic. When they decided to battle malnutrition, the way they decided to do it was in a really simple act, which they called un vaso de leche, a glass of milk. And the idea was that every kid in every town would get a glass of milk every morning. So they set up communal kitchens run by the mothers of the towns, and they basically made sure that every kid cycled through and got a glass of milk. And this was like in the 80s, and it was an incredibly powerful program. What's actually interesting is, and went on for 10 years as a powerful program. What's interesting is that you talk to people, activists now in Peru who are talking about issues around malnutrition. One of the things that they said is that it got so regular that people just started distributing the milk to the mothers directly and saying, make sure to give your kids a glass of milk once a day, and the mothers stopped doing it. So it was actually the rhythm and the ritual and that kind of, the ceremony of it that actually kept people engaged. And the moment they kind of took that away, it actually sort of fell to the wayside. So creating ceremony, creating ritual is another powerful tool. I think the last two things I'm going to talk about are about participation. So if we've talked a lot about change, this is really about how we actually get people to participate and engage and kind of make movements. We believe that more is more. And actually, for those of you who are at the lunchtime conversation about social entrepreneurship, it actually really is that the notion of scaling becomes really difficult. One of the things that actually is most important, we think, when you're trying to scale is choosing the right people to scale with. And so this is an example of a project that we did with Kaiser, working on changing the patient care experience and choosing one person, one group in a hospital as the primary change agents. And who we chose were nurses, because they were on the front lines and were actually often quite good designers. If you think about it, nurses are constantly having to reshift their environment to make it easier for them to actually work, because the environment doesn't work for them. So they were great change agents and were able to spread the change and innovation through their organization way faster. Going back to the Peru story, just since I just came back, it's like on my mind a lot. It's fascinating to see that as we started looking at women and the importance of women as kind of being well trusted, as kind of confidants in the government, not only that, they actually ran most of the businesses. Didn't mean they owned the businesses, but they actually ran businesses. They ran lots of the kind of town tiendas, they ran farms. They were actually centerpieces of the communities that they were with. And so overall, as we start going forward and thinking about how we're going to actually change, we're going to focus our change on this group. What's really interesting, this woman was amazing. We spent time on her farm in the Amazon, and so we were saying, well, that's great. We believe that you can change women, but how do you choose men? I mean, change men. And she talked about her work in domestic violence, and she said, when we try to change men with domestic violence, we did a very simple thing, which we looked at a village, and we mapped who were the alpha males, who were the men who basically were most likely to be affecting the other men around them, and we went to them first, and we asked them, we said, please, only you can change. Only you can help us kind of teach the other men to actually affect this. And that's what actually affected the change on domestic violence through it. So we think the right people enlisted in the right kinds of change can actually make huge shift. And lastly, and I think this is actually one of the key things that we're seeing in the world of innovation right now, which is that as we think about innovation, it used to be sort of individuals, one person coming up with a really bright idea, to groups of people collaborating together on smart ideas, a lot of what IDEO does and has done in the past, to now open innovation, ways of opening up things to the wider world for them to begin to solve the problems. And there's a bunch of really simple ways to think about how opening things up can actually create change. This is one of my simplest examples, but it's one of my favorite, which is the Play Me, I'm Yours pianos. I think it started in Brooklyn, but now it's spread all over the world. Basically a group that put pianos into neighborhoods where there actually wouldn't have been access to pianos on the street, and kept them tuned, and over time saw that actually it was changing. So basically older people were teaching younger people how to play the piano, people were getting together for piano and music parties on the corner, and it spread like wildfire. So a very simple catalyst that actually kind of creates a very open way of thinking, an open platform for teaching about music. Oh, sorry, hold on one second. Ooh, shoot, now I'm going to get electrocuted. Getting people involved in the experiment. This is a really interesting thing. This is actually, we're doing work with GSA, and for those of you who don't know, one of the things that Obama said in the beginning of his coming into power was basically saying, if we're going to be green, we ourselves, the government, have to act green first. So GSA, which basically is the biggest real estate holder in the US, the biggest real estate holder in the US, had basically the charge of saying, we're going to make our buildings green. How do we do that? And they had some phenomenal examples of buildings that were green. This is actually the federal building in San Francisco that has done tremendous stuff around making it green, LEED certified, but also a walkable building, one that was kind of temperature controlled. But what was interesting is when we spent time in that building, everybody hated it. Not because they hated the building, they actually loved the building, but they felt like the building was being done to them they weren't a part of the building. They weren't living the experiment. So the work that GSA is doing now is focusing more on how to get people feeling like they're involved in the change in the building than actually being sort of victims to the building. So again, how you actually participate, get communities to participate. I think this is the last example I'm going to use so I can open up for questions. But I think that one of the things that we've seen is the tremendous power of peer pressure. And Yelp is a really fascinating example. I'll be at my dentist's office, and my dentist will sort of say, he'll be like drilling away, doing his stuff, and then he'll say, just so you know, I have one bad Yelp review, and let me explain why. While he's like doing like the dental work, and I'll be like, I really don't care right now. It's totally fine. And he's like, it's somebody who's never come to me. Whenever you hear people who have bad Yelp reviews, it's somebody who's never actually used their service. Well, they never even came in, and they gave me a bad review. But what's fascinating about Yelp is that it's actually become this pretty, it's a pretty terrorizing thing for a lot of small businesses. People feel like it's actually fairly arbitrary. You'll read reviews, for instance, of restaurants in the morning, and somebody will say, it's supposed to be a great brunch restaurant. I don't like brunch, so I don't like it, and I'm giving it 1 star, things like that. So what's happened over time is it's averaged out so that all Yelp reviews out of a 1 in 5 review ends up being around 3.5 stars. So it actually doesn't really help very much. But there's a small entrepreneur in the Bay Area who's done this thing called Carrot Mob, which I thought was really fascinating, using the same power of Yelp. What they're doing is setting goals for local businesses. So they're saying to their local businesses, we want you to do this. Do this green action, do this kind of behavior, change this one thing, and we'll give you great Carrot Mob points, and we'll love you. So you'll get Carrot Mob stars. So basically, it's using the same device, but using it for a very specific pressure on the business to actually begin to act more green and act more sustainable. So I think a really simple, great example of how a tool in one case, which might actually kind of ultimately fizzle out, can be used in whole different ways. I think... I'll tell, what time is this over? What time does this end? Does anyone know? Oh, okay, cool. Let me just tell this one last thing, and then I'll open up to you. Obviously, had your hand up first. Like, get a question right off the bat. So one of the things that we're actually doing is one of the things we realize is that if you're trying to get better solutions in the world, you actually need to get people who are better at thinking about innovation and design. And so one of the things we've done recently is opened up our platform, our Human-Centered Design platform, to the world. And we originally did it with Gates Foundation to focus on farmers, agrarian solutions. And so we created a very kind of bespoke kit that was focused on how to kind of create better solutions there. We put it on our site. This is the kit. They put it on their site. What I love about it, though, is that it sort of suggested that there was a massive hunger for people to begin to think about how they could actually use real human insight to kind of create human change. Because what happened was, it wasn't the people who focused on agriculture who actually began to download it. They did. But it was other people as well. It was students. It was our clients. We have clients who called and said, banking clients who'd be like, this doesn't work very well for banks. And we're like, well, we didn't design it for you. We designed it for farmers. It was a whole different thing. Other groups entirely. This is actually one of my favorite. This is Vision Spring in India. They downloaded it and used it to look at how to kind of look at kids' eye health. And from it, we got to the insight, the notion that kids diagnosing kids' eyes actually was a way to kind of create a viral spread through the system. So they actually were able to build a whole new system for evaluation through it. And so over time, it's actually kind of begun to build on itself. And so every once in a while, we'll get emails from people or calls or actually just packages where people saying, your kit's okay, but I just made it 10 times better. So why don't you incorporate this into the kit? So what we're doing now, instead of trying to make all the changes, is we're just creating an open network for people to begin to give each other advice on how to use the kit, build on the kit, and build a better kit over time. So we just got funding for that. We're building that now as sort of a social networking site. So stay tuned, but definitely download the kit if you're interested from our website at IDEO.com. And that's it. It's up to you. Thank you. He had his hand up before, like I was even done. Oh, oh really? Well, then we actually can Green America now, so we have enough time. Or we can watch Shrek, which is the other thing. So
Shrek.
Okay, cool. Let's watch Shrek.
Quick question. Whoa, sorry. I was at a lecture just recently, and they were talking about like Yelp with the reviews, and that they were predominantly negative with a couple positive ones. What I thought was interesting is they compared it to Foursquare, where they said that the reviews were generally very, very positive, and they wondered if the mindset when you were going into it, where you're on the one hand you were collecting points and being rewarded, put you in a positive frame of mind, versus the other one where you're simply being asked, did you like it or not?
Yeah.
Set you up to say, yes, but not really.
Well, you know, I think it's really interesting because I think, and for the people who were in the lecture this morning about Facebook and what's happening, is like I think that actually one of the things that's different there is that Yelp is pretty much an anonymous network, and it's massive. And so there's actually nothing that holds you accountable to the decisions that you make. So and actually, the more people that join in an anonymous network, the more things tend to sort of equalize. Foursquare, because of its context, has a somewhat different kind of way of relating, which I would suspect allows people to kind of engage in different ways. So it's actually really interesting to think about what it means if you know the people who are also reviewing and how you can actually use that as a kind of community to build off of. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Shelly Porges,
Hi.
and I lead an initiative at the State Department called the Global Women's Business Initiative. And I'm really thrilled to hear you recognize the women of Peru, because we are about to launch a pilot in Peru.
Really?
Where you might be interested in this as a design element. We've built through an organization we've affiliated with, have a portal where the women will be able to self-register to do business with American corporations that are committed to supplier diversity. And as you may know, American corporations spend billions of dollars overseas to do this work. And we're doing this work around the world. We're focusing it on key geographies that are important to us as a country. But naturally, we want to promote prosperity in all these countries. That's always good for us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny because, like, I mean, women as agent of change isn't necessarily a surprising idea, but to see it writ large there was phenomenal. And to actually see that not only was there really massive impact that was happening by these kind of self-collected groups, but also that there was this subtle trust that women had that men didn't, that actually ultimately can be beneficial, I think. It's actually, one of the things that's interesting for those of you who don't know about Peruvian politics right now is that there's a real initiative to get 30% of women into politics. I think there's right now 15%. So one of the things that we think could be a really driving issue is trying to get some of those women into politics, both changing the perception of politics, but also getting potentially these agents of change into interesting points of power. I would well imagine. That's almost exactly what we've seen. Oh, we should talk afterwards. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts. Oh, am I supposed to point or is somebody else supposed to? Oh, okay. Sorry. Tell me if I'm doing it wrong. I will. Yeah.
Great talk. Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of visiting your company maybe a dozen years ago. Saw bicycles hanging by the desks. And it was after there was either CBS or 60 Minutes did this thing about designing the grocery cart.
Yeah, Nightline.
Nightline?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. My question then and remains now, what kinds of people do you hire or train or discover to do all this really creative, out-of-the-box stuff?
Well, so, I mean, a couple things that I'll point out here. One is that we look for eclectic, diverse groups of people, obviously, and we look for people who may not always mesh well together. We want to have collective, but enticing and powerful dialogue, so that's a big piece of what we do. We actually look for what we call T-shaped people who have one deep experience, like something that they're actually experts in, that we can actually rely on them in terms of their knowledge, but actually have a general interest in a broad spectrum of stuff, so that basically they can apply that expertise to breadth. I will tell you though, I believe that a lot of the things that that I talked about today are actually inbuilt in us all. When I say that we're all designers, I actually really do believe that we're all designers. I think that it does, put IDEO aside, because I kind of don't care about who we hire for a moment, who we work with. When I think about like transforming hospitals or transforming government, we're doing a lot of work with government right now. And these are people who everyone's saying, you can't apply innovation in government context. Nobody wants to do it, nobody can do it, and they do. There's hunger for it. There's hunger, I think, for this notion of being able to kind of apply these things and be creative and think in different ways. And so I think some of it's about who we hire and some of it's just what we allow people to tap into in themselves. And I think that's something for us all to think about as we go forward. So. We'll try to make her run around as much as possible. At this high altitude, we'll see a faint for sure. So.
Inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Can't help but wonder, because I'm curious, with all those bags of trash in Estonia. What did one family do with it? Ship it to Latvia or Lithuania?
You know, it's really funny. I was looking at the pictures and I was like, I hope somebody doesn't say, where did it all go? Because there's a lot of trash there. I don't know. You'll have to find out. I'd be really curious to know. But check it out. There's some phenomenal videos. And this is another example, going back to that 1 hour thing, the power down. This is caught on as well. So other countries are doing this as well, setting the same kind of deadline, setting the same kind of thing. There's a really great case study to look at because it's also a great case study in choosing the right people to motivate people to actually get involved. So it's a really nice story to look at. Take a look online. Does he get 2 questions? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's not actually my question. This comes online from Twitter. Someone wanted to know, with the whole Estonia thing, 40,000 volunteers, how did they get 40,000 volunteers?
Well, it's actually really interesting. So I've been reading about it. One of the things that we're trying to do at IDEA right now is, because systemic change is becoming more and more a kind of key piece of the things we have to think about, is gathering as many stories of systemic change as we possibly can pull together and begin to say, well, what are the principles that apply to this? So how does something like this work? How does that actually kind of play? In this case, there was a bunch of things. Actually, can I back up? What's even more interesting than how they got the people is how they located the trash. So what was really interesting is they had volunteers who used geo-tracking and kind of the mapping software to basically kind of create, through satellites and stuff, ways of understanding where the biggest clusters of trash was. Because it was actually like, where do they go to get the trash? And then to move it to wherever else they moved it to, their neighbors or whatever. But they did what they from the beginning chose the most prominent business leads in the country to be a part of it. So that was actually a really smart start. And that group was actually able to recruit, as you would imagine, the next most prominent group, or even more, lots of celebrities, lots of rock stars, all the kinds of things that you would actually typically rely on. It's a small country, so they can actually have impact much quicker, I think. But so it was actually through fairly traditional means, viral, of getting out and kind of organizing around the one day kind of celebratory moment around it. But I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from this that I think I'm eager to kind of see what we can pull from that.
Hi, thanks. I found all of these examples on, how do you affect change to be fascinating, and I live on the East Coast, and I've always been disappointed on how slowly it's been to catch on to recycling and kind of being more green as compared to the West Coast. And in Washington, D.C., where I live, there's been this whole movement of trying to work on the demand side of getting rid of all these plastic bags that people buy their groceries in. And despite all those campaigns of trying to raise awareness, there were 2 grocery stores in the last 2 years that basically said, we'll charge you 5 cents every time, you want a plastic bag. And it was remarkable. There was something like a 90% drop in people, wanting plastic bags and being willing to pay for it. And so you had this revolution of everywhere I go now, I see people, carrying that, which has been happening on the West Coast for years, but, on the East Coast, nobody cares about the environment, it appears, because it's herd mentality and it's kind of the inconvenience. And so I just wonder, if you're looking at affecting change, why is it slow to catch on? And is it really the case that when it hits your pocketbook, that's when it really matters?
Well, that's a really interesting thing, because financial incentives always make differences, and we know that, and there's all kinds of ways to play off that. So I don't think that we should ignore the notion that those kinds of things can actually have impact. But I would call into a question whether or not 5 cents is actually what's impacting the change. It may be, but on a more optimistic side, it also just reminds you that change needs to happen. If the moment you actually see that that's going to happen, or that there's a reminder constantly, it actually gives you a reason to continually think about it. So that's a very West Coast optimistic way of looking at something, which is why I get to come to Aspen and not someplace on the East Coast. But it's like, I think that it'll be interesting to see. Because I would say that I think we are seeing some kind of change happening way faster, and some change as slow as always. And I think that's, again, going back to looking at these big systemic changes, beginning to understand what's affecting, why does one change and why one doesn't. And that's I think what we're actually trying to root out with the work we're doing now. So stay tuned. Hopefully there's a good book in it or something, or picture book is what I'm hoping. So anything else? It's really nice outside, so I don't have to keep you for... Thank you so much. I appreciate you giving me the time. Thank you.